The whole is a stable equilibrium of all the parts, and each part is a spirit at home in this whole, a spirit which does not seek its satisfaction outside of itself, but finds it within itself, because it is itself in this equilibrium with the whole. This equilibrium can, it is true, only be a living one by inequality existing in it and being brought back to equilibrium by justice. Justice, however, is neither an alien entity remote from this whole, nor the reality, unworthy of the name of justice, of mutual malice, treachery, ingratitude, etc., which would execute judgment in an unreasoning, arbitrary manner, by misunderstanding the context of the action, and by unconscious acts of omission and commission. On the contrary, it is the justice of human law which brings back into the universal the element of being for self which is broken away from the balanced whole. That is, the independent classes and individuals. It is the government of the nation, which is the self-affirming individuality of the universal essence and the self-conscious will of all. The justice, however, which brings back to equilibrium the universal and its ascendancy over the individual is equally the simple spirit of the individual who has suffered wrong. It is not split up into two, the one who has suffered the wrong in an entity in a remote beyond. The individual himself is the power of the netherworld, and it is his Irenes, his fury, which wreaks vengeance. For his individuality, his blood, still lives on in the household. His substance has an enduring reality. The wrong which can be inflicted on the individual in the ethical realm is simply this, that something merely happens to him. The power which inflicts this wrong on the conscious individual of making him into a mere thing is nature. It is the universality not of the community, but the abstract universality of mere being. And the individual, in avenging the wrong he has suffered, does not turn against the former, for it is not at its hands that he has suffered, but against the latter. As we saw, the consciousness of those who share the blood of the individual repair this wrong in such a way that what has simply happened becomes rather a work deliberately done, in order that the mere being of the wrong, its ultimate form, may also be something willed and thus something agreeable. There is a lot here going on in paragraph 462, and what Hegel is sketching out for us is particularly fascinating because he is finally coming to this question of justice, and we're going to see that justice has multiple sides to it and is supposed to somehow encompass multiple sides at once. So there is almost, in certain respects, a mirroring of the disequilibrium of equilibrium that's taking place here at a lower level, and I'll say why it's a lower level in just a moment. So I do want to start out by talking about this notion of the whole. He talks about the whole being a stable equilibrium of all the parts, and each part is a spirit at home in this whole, a spirit which does not seek its satisfaction outside of itself, but finds it within itself, because it is itself in this equilibrium with the whole. So in that very first sentence, there's already a lot to be unpacked. And let's begin with this notion of whole and parts. Another way in which we might translate ganz in this case is the totality. And what do we mean by the totality? Well, we have the way that Hegel is depicting it, a community which is essentially a closed unit. If we want to use Parmenidean language, an unbounded sphere, right? Encompassing everything. It is the range in which meaning can arise and develop and be worked out by individuals in their relations with each other. So it's the whole, or it's the totality. And then he says that this is a stable equilibrium. We'll come back to that notion in just a second. But notice what else he's saying here, that each one of the parts, in a certain sense, reflects the entirety of the whole, or the totality of the other parts that it is connected with. And you want to think about, well, how does this actually work? Well, think about the ways in which enculturation works, where an individual who is, if just considered by themselves, essentially a meat machine, an animal, right? The rationality that we have as human beings, this is something where Hegel is on to a very important point. The rationality that we have as human beings is not a rationality that would be totally estranged from and prior to any culture or community or even family relations altogether. To be rational is to be, at least in an incipient way, social, to be engaged with others. Not just the other of, say the master-slave dialectic or the struggle for recognition, but others in so many other determinate ways, the ways in which we ourselves encounter people, the things we can remember, how indeed we were brought up in the families that we were, the schools that we went to, the friendships that we had, the clubs that we were members of and perhaps left behind, the larger community that we took part in, institutions that we either were drafted into or volunteered for, like going into military service or engaging in some other similar commitment. So I mentioned we would come back to talking about this stable equilibrium. That is an important point. Strictly speaking, equilibrium might not be the best way to convey what's being said here, because the German term for it, which we can translate as equilibrium, quite frankly, Gleichwichtigkeit, saying that each of the things has a similar weight. Now, we can have equilibrium because what we do is we balance everything out in very complicated manners so that the center of gravity is in the middle. But this is actually saying this term is actually saying something here at the lexical level, that each of these member parts has an equal importance, an equal weight. It wouldn't necessarily have to mean that if it were not for the fact that Hegel then begins talking about inequality and the need for justice. So what is the weight? It's not physical weight, of course. It has to do with how people are treated and what they're allowed and what they allow themselves to do. So he says this equilibrium can only be a living one. This is a point that we made a little bit earlier. An equilibrium can only be a living one, a vital one, a dynamic one, if there is some movement within it. And the movement within this is in terms of value. Inequality comes in, right? Inequality arises in it, and then the equilibrium is restored by the workings of justice. Now, Hegel is not going to try to provide a complete, full, substantive definition of justice at this point. He will, however, tell us what it isn't, and that's quite important. So we'll look at that in a moment. But we should first think about this. What does justice do? Justice takes the unequal that shouldn't be unequal, because sometimes inequality is the way things ought to be, and it fixes it in some way. Perhaps not entirely, and not the same way in every single circumstance, for every type of case, but it adjusts things. It brings things back into an equilibrium for the parts. In this case, the parts of the ethical whole, that is, the society. What isn't justice? So here's what Hegel tells us justice is not. It's not an alien entity remote from this whole. So it's not something coming in from the outside, say, a divine revelation. This is justice. You must follow these laws, and only if you do so will you be just, or as people like to say, justified or made righteous. Hegel is not saying that that's the case. There is, of course, the element of divine law, but that's not involved here yet. What else isn't justice? Justice is not simply what we might call, a equilibrium of self-interest or transactional justice. The way that he puts it, a very great phrase here, I think. It is not the reality, which he acknowledges this is in fact a reality, unworthy of the name of justice, however, of mutual malice, treachery, ingratitude, etc., which would execute judgment in an unreasoning, arbitrary manner. Justice is not simply those who have the power balancing each other off and engaging in reprisals to keep anybody from getting too big for their proverbial britches or those sorts of things. Oftentimes that gets called justice. And when we think about the way that the administration of justice or criminal justice works within our societies, we are in fact confronted with many cases like that, where we see discretion turn into arbitrary exercise of authority simply to suit one's passions of fear or desire or anger or whatever else. That's not justice, according to Hegel. That can actually sometimes have an effect of restoring some equilibrium or reducing certain injustices or inequalities, but that's more or less an accidental success. He goes on and he says that this kind of justice that is not really justice would misunderstand the context of the action, and by unconscious acts of omission and commission would execute judgment in an unreasoning, arbitrary manner. So it cannot be justice sort of just as transactions by whoever happens to have the power or who gets to speak. It cannot be just arbitrary judgments made on the spot. There has to be something more to it. So he goes on and he says, on the contrary, it is the justice of human law which brings back into the universal the element of being for self, which is broken away from the balanced whole. What is he talking about there? He'll tell us in just another sentence, but we should pause. Why do inequalities that call for justice arise? They don't arise just because people say, man, I want to screw with somebody else. I'm going to take what they got. Well, sometimes that does happen, right? They arise in part because subjects, human beings, human persons, think that doing something that perhaps they may not even realize is producing an inequality, a disequilibrium, a jar to the system, is best for them to do. They see that as what is advantageous or what is reasonable for them to do, and they act accordingly. Why do they do that? Because they are caught within this logic of the being for itself. Now, let's think about what Hegel actually says here. Who are doing these sorts of things? He says, the element of being for self which is broken away from the balanced whole. What is that? The independent classes and individuals. It is very possible for individuals, because of their sort of short-sightedness and the fact that they can't read everybody else's minds, to not be cognizant of how their own actions and choices and commitments are affecting other people. The person who years and years ago enacted some particular policy within his or her apartment building that would affect the way the tenants lived, and just made some decisions about what to put in terms of renovations, may have screwed over their tenants without realizing it. And it may be necessary at some point to say, hey, this needs to be addressed. And the person, may be tempted to say, I acted in good faith. I did everything the way I should. Or they may say, well, everybody does what's good for them, and that's it. They may be much more bald-faced about it. We can also talk in terms of classes. When it comes to this stable equilibrium of the whole, what's the case when we have classes of people who think that the way in which they're living is indeed what they're entitled to, and if it affects other people negatively, well, screw them. Or, well, that's unfortunate, but there's nothing to be done about it. Or we can go on and on and on. Well, this happens all the time in society after society after society, and the administration of justice is something that addresses that. We see this occurring throughout history, particularly with class dynamics. As one class becomes more important in power, another class starts to decline, feels threatened, it insists on its prerogatives, finds other ways to glom on to what's going on there. Meanwhile, the lower classes are quite often, being screwed around by all the play of these other classes. Justice should be addressing that, he says. So what is going to be able to do that? He says, it's the government. Remember, we've talked about this before, the ruling apparatus of the nation. It's the government of the nation, he says, which is the self-affirming individuality of the universal essence and the self-conscious will of all. Now, this is a bit of an idealization, of course, right? The government doesn't always turn out to be the self-conscious will of all. Sometimes there's a bit of will of one or will of a particular class being involved. And this is a real issue that Hegel is going to address. Now he goes on and he says, the justice which brings back to equilibrium the universal in its ascendancy over the individual is also something else. It is also the simple spirit of the individual who has suffered wrong. This is what often gets left out of the picture and doesn't get addressed by the human law, which is looking at the whole society and trying to restore some sort of equilibrium that works out better for the whole. The individual can get lost in the shuffle, as we say, or fall through the cracks. We have all these wonderful metaphors that have to do with, losing sight of the determinate individual who has actually been wronged. We see this all the time in criminal justice settings when people are saying, look, policy, dictates that we do this, and then criminal rights people are like, listen, these people did this stuff to these people, and that needs to be somehow brought back into the picture. So what Hegel tells us is this. The justice is not split up into two, the one who has suffered wrong and an entity in a remote beyond. The individual himself is the power of the netherworld, the wronged individual. Sometimes the wronged individual can take action on his or her own account. Sometimes they require something else to happen. So, he talks about the individual is the power of the netherworld and is his irenes, his fury which wreaks vengeance. The irenes punished offenses. They are part of the divine law in traditional Greek mythology. You see this reflected in the stories of the playwrights, right? So he goes on and he says, his individuality, his blood, lives on in the household. His substance has an enduring reality. Or does it? This is what is up for question in the actions of the household. He goes on and he says, the wrong which can be inflicted on the individual in the ethical realm is simply this. Now notice what Hegel says here, that something merely happens to him. When a person is not being treated as an individual, one aspect of that is that their personhood, their agency is being ignored, and the agency of what happens to them is also being reduced to the natural or the necessary, or you just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, buddy. It's unfortunate that you got shot in the drive-by, but they were shooting for these other gang members, and you just happened to catch a bullet by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or it's unfortunate that the tax laws ended up working out the way that they did. They're really working great for the majority of the nation, and they kind of screwed you. Nothing personal about it. It's just the way things are. And we can come up with example after example after example. Here Hegel talks about this in terms of a power that's inflicting the wrong on the conscious individual, turning them into a mere thing. This power is, as he says, nature. And he says it's not the universality of the community. Instead, it is the abstract universality of mere being. This is something that can happen with justice and its administration. The administration of justice by the government can turn into treating human beings as mere beings. And it happens all the time. And it's a tragic situation because it's rather difficult to avoid. Now, in this case, the family, on the part of the wronged individual, seeks out some justice of its own. And he says, in avenging the wrong that he has suffered, the individual does not turn against the community, for it's not at its hands that he has suffered, but against the latter, the abstract universality, right, and nature. So he goes on and he says, as we saw, the consciousness of those who share the blood of the individual repair this wrong in such a way. And now notice what's going on here. Let me actually read the passage, and then there's a really important reflection. Repair the wrong in such a way that what has simply happened becomes rather a work deliberately done, in order that the mere being of the wrong, its ultimate form, may also be something willed and thus something agreeable. We often hear people who are opposed to, doing something about some sort of inequality or some sort of crime or some sort of damage that has taken place say, well, if you do that measure, you enact that law, or you give that person that judgment, it's not going to bring back whatever is the case. It won't bring back the dead child. It won't, give them their career back. It won't. And this is like a litany. What Hegel is saying is, yes, of course it won't. That's not what's at issue. What's at issue is what happened to the person and whether that can be humanized, whether that can be turned into something that means something rather than just, one more case of a person being ground up within the wheels of necessity. Because you see, the social world is a world of all sorts of necessities. But it's also a world in which we think and engage with others. So it's not necessarily, to bring back the individual or to have them vicariously. When, say, for example, a candlelight vigil is taking place where a murder occurred or where somebody was gunned down, unjustly by the very mechanics of justice that were supposed to be protecting them. They're not trying to say, well, the individual lives on. People do say this sort of thing, of course, but Hegel would say, that's kind of nonsense. What you're doing is you're restoring back to that person the dignity of being a person, and that's about as much as you can do. And if the community as a whole really understands what it means to be a community oriented by justice, it will be in favor of that. However, that's not going to always be the case, and we're going to see tragic situations arise where justice in two senses is going to clash with each other. The ethical realm is in this way in its enduring existence an immaculate world, a world unsullied by any internal dissension. Similarly, its process is a tranquil transition of one of its powers into the other, in such a way that each preserves and brings forth the other. We do indeed see it divide itself into two essences and their reality, but their antithesis is rather the authentication of one through the other, and where they come into direct contact with each other as real opposites, their middle term and common element is their immediate interpenetration. The one extreme, the universal self-conscious spirit, becomes through the individuality of the man united with its other extreme, its force and element, with unconscious spirit. On the other hand, the divine law has its individualization, or the unconscious spirit of the individual, its real existence, in the woman, through whom, as the middle term, the unconscious spirit rises out of its unreality into actual existence, out of a state in which it is unknowing and unconscious, into the realm of conscious spirit. The union of man and woman constitutes the active middle term of the whole and the element which sunders itself into these extremes of divine and human law. It is equally their immediate union which converts those first two syllogisms into one and the same syllogism and unites into one process the opposite movements, one from actuality down to unreality, the downward movement of human law organized into independent members to the danger and trial of death, and the other the upward movement of the law of the netherworld to the actuality of the light of day and a conscious existence. Of these movements, the former falls to man, the latter to woman. In paragraph 463, Hegel is bringing this entire section to a very strong close, talking about these two sides, these two extremes that are connected by a middle term. He's also going to employ the language of syllogism, which might be a little bit misleading here because he's not arranging things in actual syllogisms. We would have to read that in, and I think that would be a bit of a distraction at this point. Now, he tells us that the ethical realm is, in its enduring existence, an immaculate world, a world unsullied by any internal dissension. Now, he's just talked about how that's not the case for the ethical substance. So how is this going to work out? He says, its process is a tranquil transition of one of its powers into the other in such a way that each preserves and brings forth the other. How is that going to happen? The linchpin here is going to be this middle term, which he's going to tell us is the union of man and woman. So what we've got going on here is something ideal, not actually conforming to the real that he's just discussed in terms of how justice plays itself out, but what we're shooting for. So he tells us this. We see the ethical realm divide itself into two essences in their reality, but their antithesis is rather the authentication of one through the other. And where they come into direct contact with each other as real opposites, their middle term and common element is their immediate interpenetration. So we have a mediating middle term. And you say, well, what is that mediating middle term? Hegel says it is their very relation to each other. The relation between man and woman. And on both sides, something is going to take place, but it's going to take place through the mediation of the other in this middle term. So it's a little bit complex what he's saying here, but I think that's probably the best way to understand it. He says, the one extreme, universal self-conscious spirit, becomes through the individuality of the man united with its other extreme, its force and element, unconscious spirit. That is where the divine law is taking place, the family, the community, which is understanding itself, is grounded in unconscious spirit. And we're going to see the unconscious play a major role as we go on. He says, on the other hand, the divine law has its individuation, or the unconscious spirit of the individual, its real existence, in the woman, who, as the middle term, the woman is functioning as a middle term, the unconscious spirit rises out of its unreality into actual existence, out of a state in which it is unknowing and unconscious, into the realm of conscious spirit. So how does the unconscious become conscious? Through the woman. But not just the woman per se, but the woman related to the man. Just similarly, the man related to the woman can be a middle term. So he tells us that this middle term is the union of man and woman, right? It sunders itself into these extremes of divine and human law. Then he talks about syllogisms, and I would say at this point don't worry too much about that. But what we want to focus on are these upward and downward movements. What is the downward movement? He says there's a downward movement from human law into from actuality down to unreality. The human law organized into independent members to the danger and trial of death. Now, that might make you think back to the self-consciousness section and the struggle to the death. Go ahead and think about that, but also think ahead to what's coming up in the section yet to appear, where we're going to see two brothers square off against each other, right? And then there's an upward movement as well from the divine law coming upward into actuality and conscious existence. Both of these are made possible by the mediating term of the woman and the man and the mediation that is connecting both of them in the end of this section.